reality, this will be our last class. So we're going to finish up the problem of evil and move on to the meaning of life. Let's see, the final exam opens right after class. It's available at 3 o'clock today, Thursday, and it'll be available till the following Thursday at 5 o'clock when the lab closes. Don't forget that at the end of the term, the lab closes for spring term 5 o'clock Thursday. Not today, but next Thursday, the Thursday of final exam week. And same drill as the other two exams, and make your 3x5 card, go over the material. It's not comprehensive, it's just the stuff after the second midterm exam. Have any questions, come by office hours today, or send me a Moodle message. And office hours will be a little different next week. They will only be Thursday from 2 to 4 o'clock. So I may be available, like probably Thursday morning would be the earliest I'll be available next week. Although I might have some time to chat on the phone briefly. So, if you need to see me any other time than today during my regular office hours 3 to 4, or next week 2 to 4 on Thursday, just send me a little message. We can set up an appointment. It might have to be on the phone if it's unless it's Thursday morning. Okay, so God answers Job from a whirlwind as we left off, and recall that God has this bet with Satan over his servant Job, and he says, "Look at my servant Job. Look how he serves me. Look how dutiful and loyal he is." And Satan says, "That's just because you bless him with all these material possessions, and he has a wonderful family, and you give him all this stuff." So essentially, Satan says, "Well, you're just bribing Job with all this stuff, and of course he serves you, right? It's sort of a tit for tat, right? It's like you give your politics, you plunk down like maybe your special interest group, you plunk down some money from." Got audio?
I think the mute switch is on. Yeah.
Should I start over, or you get picked up on the overhead?
Yeah, we picked it up.
Okay, cool. God's bragging about Job and says, "Look at how great my servant is," and Satan says, "Oh, he just serves you because you give him stuff." It's sort of like I don't know, you make your donation to your congressman and he votes the way you want him to, right? It's not like he's doing it out of principle. He's doing it because you're bribing him with campaign cash from like a special interest group or a big corporation or something like that. So the idea is the same thing with God is essentially bribing Job to serve him. And so God says, Job serves me because he generally reveres me and respects me, not because of the stuff I give him. And just to prove it, well, actually, I think Satan's the one that proposed this. So Satan brings up this point that God gives him all the stuff, and then and God says, "Okay, tell you what, let's test this. So you have my permission to take away everything Job has, and I bet you he'll still serve me." And I think it's maybe perhaps Satan who makes that charge. So Satan says, if you take away all the stuff you've given to Job, Job will curse you. And so God says, "Okay, Satan, you're on." So they have this sort of gentleman's wager about what Job's going to do. And so it's not as if it's like obvious that Satan's the one who's doing all this stuff to Job. So his, so I think like a big like natural disasters strike, and you get like a tornado takes down his house and kills his family, and roving bands of nomads kill all his cattle, and pretty soon he's left with nothing, and he's sitting on like the ruins of his house, and then he makes this famous statement, "The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away, blessed be the name of the Lord." Right? So, and then his three comforters, his supposed friends, come and say, "Well, you must have done something to tick off God." And Job, throughout it, protests his innocence, And at one point he says, if God were to come down right now, boy, I'd give him a piece of my mind. And then at the end of the book, God shows up, right? And Job sort of stammers apologies and says, that he spoke at a turn. I have said things too wonderful for me to know. I repent in dust and ashes. And God's happy with that. But he lectures Job for like 3 pages in the book on, where were you when I created the world? Can you explain to me like how I created the celestial bodies and all the animals? And Job just, has no response. And so if you look at, what's the answer to the problem of evil in the book of Job? So God lectures Job and Job repents. Then God gives him the reward here. So God gives him back his blessings. And he gets, twice the cattle and the really nice house, and he replaces all the kids that Satan killed with new kids, and he's got twice as many kids, and it's nothing better than a big happy family, right? So God makes it all better. And at the end, you can really see this as sort of what's sometimes called a human ignorance theodicy. So a theodicy is an attempt to explain the problem of evil without compromising either God's omnipotence, the fact that he can do anything, and also, or his goodness, that he's benevolent and morally perfect, right? So those are 2 essential qualities of God, that he can do anything, that he's all-powerful, and also that he's all good. So the question of the problem of evil is, well, if God's all-powerful, why doesn't he prevent evil? If God is all good, it seems like he'd want to prevent evil, and yet it seems evil exists, at least, cast out in terms of human suffering. So, and the book of Job basically says, well, we really can't hope to understand God's reasons for what he does. And the idea is that we shouldn't question God's decisions. We should just trust and obey. We should be like Job, minus like the back talking, right? We should just trust God knows what he's doing, and obey him. And there's an old Christian rock song by Randy Stonehill, and he says, I don't understand all the mysteries of the master plan, but I'm sure the master does, so that's okay, right? So that's sort of the line in the book of Job, that God, he's God, we're not. God knows things that we don't know, and it is a hubris for human beings to think that we can know the mind of God, and maybe someday God will explain it to us. And note though that when God answers Job in the whirlwind, he doesn't explain himself. He doesn't say, well, Job, I'm sorry I put you through all this hell, and I left out the boils, right? The oozing boils and sores, Imagine being, 17 again with like a really bad case of acne times a million. And he's, got these oozing sores all over his body, sitting on the ruins of his house. His family, all his kids are dead. He's lost all his wealth. And God, just to punish him extra, God left his nagging wife alive, who's there berating him, telling him just to put himself out of his misery, to curse God, and maybe God will have mercy and strike him dead. And so that's, and God doesn't say, well, sorry I put through all this hell, Job, but I had this bet with Satan. See, and Satan said that the only reason you serve me is that I gave you all this stuff. And I said, no, Job's like a faithful servant. Even if you take away all the stuff, he'd still serve me. And then Satan says, well, I bet if you take away all the stuff that he'll curse you. And I said, I bet he won't. And then one thing led to another, and so I said, go ahead and do it all. And he doesn't tell Job any of this stuff, right? So Job's clueless at the end of the book. The reader knows, but Job has no idea what's going on. And when God lectures him, he just basically says, who are you to question me? And so at the end he says, but you endured, and so here's reward. You get twice what you had before. And there's this idea that life is kind of a test to see whether we'll remain faithful to God and continue to serve him when he's not blessing us. And this goes back to the kind of the Old Testament idea that wealth is a sign of God's blessing, and that health also is a sign of God's blessing. So when you look at like the book at the end of the Tanakh, the first 5 books of the Bible, or the Torah, the Pentateuch, if you like, right? Those first 5 books, and at the end of Deuteronomy, Joshua says, I lay before you blessings and cursings, and if you follow God, you're going to get all these blessings. And it's cashed out in material stuff in this life. There's no idea of heavenly reward, and depending on how you read the book of Job, the book of Job doesn't really talk about an afterlife. There are a couple of passages that I think up to interpretation, where the grammar is kind of ambiguous and it's not clear what it's saying, and some people think it's talking about resurrection, but the whole tenet of the book doesn't talk about an afterlife really at all. The whole problem of evil, nobody ever says, hey Job, even though life sucks right now, God's going to give you a heavenly reward when you die. This doesn't come into the conversation. It's all about what happens in this life. And so if this life is all there is, then if you end up suffering, it seems like that makes God unjust. And actually, one of the theories about how the idea of the afterlife sort of came about is it evolved over this worry about how could a just God allow the good to suffer and the evil to prosper. And people came up with this idea, well, there must be something after this where God sort of rewards the good and punishes the evil. So anyway, the idea is that life is kind of this trial or a test to see whether we will remain faithful even when God's not blessing us and life doesn't seem to make sense, and when we're suffering. So what do you think about this as like an answer to the problem of evil? It's sort of pointing out the human ignorance about the God's reasons. The idea is that God has reasons, but he's not telling us what they are for his own reasons, I guess. And it's irrational for us to think that we could know what God's reasons are. But it seems like God could have a morally sufficient reason for evil, and the fact that we don't know what it is now doesn't mean that there isn't a reason. What do you think? Or any other comments about the book of Job?
Really, the fact that we're curious about the world around us, but we're kind of not supposed to explore, question God, think about how God would think or something. It just...
It almost seems like it goes against human nature.
Yeah.
Sounds like a religion of submission.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's to coin a phrase from a different religion, but yeah. This is true. Like in the Old Testament, and Islam is actually a lot like like Judaism. It's more like Judaism than Christianity. It's based on this sort of a strict religious code, and it's based on obedience. In the Old Testament, the height of virtue is obedience. So you look at the story of Abraham. So God asked Abraham to kill his only son as a kind of a loyalty test. And again, it's sort of like it's crazy. It seems crazy to Abraham, like especially since God promised that he would be the father of a mighty nation, and he's 80 years old, and he's finally had a kid miraculously, and his wife is the same age, right? So it's a miracle that they had a baby at all. And now his son's grown up, and God says, I want you to make your son into a human sacrifice. And the idea is that if Abraham will kill his own son, that he'll do anything, right? Well, you think about that as a test, it's kind of like, it seems like if I were God, and that was my test, if he said, no, God, I won't kill my own son, that's wrong, I'd say, good job, you passed. But what happens in the test is that Abraham's he ties his kid up, and he's got the dagger, he's about to pull it across his neck and cut his throat, and then an angel comes and grabs his hand and says, no, don't do it, it was just a test. Right? And that seems kind of harsh, but that shows...
Why does God have to do that if he already knows that
he already knows all the outcomes.
Well, that's a good question.
So why does he have to put them through these ridiculous things if he knows what
Because
the outcome
he's greedy and he gets rewarded. If he killed Isaac, like, well, you know, Isaac's in the kingdom. I now have like more energy in my kingdom, and you know, I'm gonna profit off of your suffering. Is what it sounds like. Abraham's gonna suffer. He's gonna rule more suffering, and then I get all the good shit at the end of the day.
But I think, but the idea is that God's an omnipotent being. He's already got everything. I mean, God doesn't need.
Yeah, but then he doesn't need us to go to heaven then either, does he?
Well, maybe he wants to, but like, why?
So then he's getting what he wants, and he's getting something that he doesn't already have. Because if he wanted it, he shouldn't want it if he already has it.
Well, why aren't we in heaven now?
Exactly.
So rather than like, you know, if God's sort of perfect, if God's perfect, he might want things that, you know, he might want things that maybe you don't. I mean, I can see, like, you can kind of make a point that if God's perfect and he has some unfulfilled desire, then he's not really perfect, I suppose. I mean, there's people do make that kind of argument. But assume for a second you can sort of imagine that so God's got human beings on earth, he's sort of letting them do their thing, and then he's putting us to the ringer, and the question is like, why would he do that? And this idea that life is a test is that God's sort of waiting to see what we're going to do. But if God knows everything, he already knows what we're going to do. And then why, like, the test to begin with? Like, why? So he takes human beings that are flawed or maybe not flawed from the beginning, but end up being flawed. And then he's going to make them unflawed. Well, why doesn't he just sort of wave his magic wand and make human beings the way he wants them right now?
Because he wants us to have free will. That's the argument I'm
Yeah.
always confronted with. God wanted us to have free will, but if free will was...
It's not free because we're trapped by choice now.
Yeah, we're trapped
We
by...
always have to make a choice. We're never
death.
not free to not choose. Even not choosing is a choice to not choose. So it's like,
Yeah.
is it really free again?
There's a question about, like, whether human beings really have free choice, at least according to the biblical narrative. There's this idea that Adam had a free choice, but then after that, all his descendants have this propensity to sin.
Yeah.
And so no one can...
And
It's
his free
impossible for
choice
him
was
to
a
be perfect.
free choice.
And he was kind of our representative, but, you know, I didn't vote for him, right? So
Yeah.
I didn't know
Yeah,
why
is
does
it
he get
free will
stand in for me?
based off of being able to decide anything and not having a consequence for it? Or is free will being able to do things and still having a consequence?
Yeah, it sounds like God wanted ignorance from the moment he made the garden. Like, I'm going to create something you don't need and can't have inside perfection. So you're taunted
Yeah.
by this one thing in perfection. Like, you're supposed to, like, be ignorant of the thing you can't have and just accept what you have and be ignorant of the rest so you don't violate. So it sounds like ignorance is the key.
It's super delicious looking too, like the fruit, like the story. It says, you know, it looked, and this is a time before people had like candies and, you know, fruit pies and like delicious stuff to eat, right? It's all like the idea of a dessert would be like a piece of fruit, like a really ripe, like a pomegranate, or you know, an apple is something that became typical, but the original fruit's not an apple in the story. But the idea is some sort of like, you ever like maybe in like the middle of the summer, you like pick like a really ripe peach off a tree and just like, you know, bite into it and it's really sweet and juicy. That's sort of the idea of the forbidden fruit.
Yeah, why did he make it taste good?
Well, and then the idea is that it's, you know, it's a temptation, right? Otherwise it wouldn't be tempting. So anyway, coming back to Job, it seems like, why does God have to test us to begin with? And the idea is, well, we got to learn something. Well, why didn't God just like build that knowledge into us to start out with?
Also, why did he put it in the center of the garden?
Yeah. So yeah, it's like what's like out there for you to see, right?
It's just
Why do you have to make knowledge evil on top of that?
Well, so it's the knowledge. It's not necessarily the knowledge is evil, but it's like
The
having if you eat the fruit, you have the knowledge of good and evil, and that's why after they eat it, and actually it says in the story, interestingly enough, it says if you get the knowledge of good and evil, you'll be like God, and God didn't want, looks like from the story anyway, competition. It says you'll be like God or as gods, knowing good and evil. And it looks like God like told a fib, telling them it was poison basically, so they wouldn't eat it.
So if God didn't want competition, why give us the ability to compete with him?
So yeah, so I don't know. There
why
might be a lot
would he
of problems
lie
with the story.
about it?
In more of and
Is
more
it lying evil?
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, you make a good point. So I like the story there. So it looks like, paradoxically, like, the serpent, later, interpreted as Satan, but in the original story, it's just like a talking snake. It's he's the craftiest of the beasts of the field. And the serpent says, you won't die. God is trying to like trick you and by telling you it's poison, and because he doesn't want you to have the knowledge of good and evil. And Eve eats and gives it to Adam to eat, and it says, behold, their eyes were open, knowing good and evil, which is just what the serpent said would happen. And then God gets pissed off and kicks him out of the garden. And then we're cursed for and disobey God like after that. So so it seems, but I mean, all this sort of speculation is like the book of Job says, don't try to figure it out. You'll never be able to figure it out, and it's not your job. It's God's job to know stuff. It's your job to obey. And you might know when you die. God might tell you, but in this life, it's a one big mystery. So is that really an answer?
No, it sounds like he wants slaves. Don't question, just do as you're told, and you're gonna get something in the end when you're dead.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, maybe like, how about pitching this? So, if you, as a human being, we lack knowledge. We're imperfect. We're sinful, morally corrupt, and so we're trying to figure out the mind of God, the mind of an infinite being who created life, the universe, and everything. Why should we expect to be able to get an answer to God's master plan this side of eternity? That seemed a little, I think the author of the book of Job might say prideful. Job gets lectured about okay, here, can you explain this to me, Job? No. Can you explain that to me, Job? No. Can you tell me how I created the universe? No, I'm not really sure about that. So to try to figure out why there's good and evil, I think the book of Job says, well, we can just never know that, and so don't rack your brain trying to figure it out. And that's part of the reason Job suffers as much as he does, is he's wondering, why, God, why? Instead of just saying, well, he also has some comfort, and he says, well, this is God's world, and God is a potter, I'm the clay. He can do what he wants, and it is what it is, right? So he has a kind of stoical attitude towards all the suffering, but then he swings back and forth between that and this wondering why, and it seems like the human ignorance thing still think about think about whether it be possible to that God has a morally sufficient reason. So I I have my Charles Manson analogy, right? So I actually had a friend who knew Manson and put out CDs of his teaching and music, whitedevilrecords.com. And you can buy CDs of Manson's music and his teachings. Guns N' Roses ripped off one of his songs, Look at Your Game Girl, and put it out. And so he made all these jailhouse recordings. There's the guy's so what Manson did is he didn't actually do any of the killing himself, but he got all these wayward teenagers and 20-somethings with psychological problems, and he got them all hopped up on drugs, LSD and weed and whatever, and brainwashed them into being his cultic followers, and then convinced them they were going to start a race war by killing some rich white movie stars and then making it look like black people did it, and then starting a race war, and after which he and his followers would rule the world. That's sort of you can read all about it in Helter Skelter. So crazy, evil, maybe a little bit of both, right? So there. Now imagine knowing those facts. I were to tell you, my friend talked to Manson, and Manson told him the reason why that was actually a moral thing to do, and told me things that totally convinced me that Charles Manson is Jesus Christ incarnate, come back to the earth, and that all this is part of God's plan. And now I'm not allowed to divulge the the secrets of the Manson murders and why they were actually a virtuous action. But you just have to trust me on this. Like, could you imagine I would tell you anything, possibly tell you anything that would like justify killing innocent people to try to stoke the fires of racial tension and start a race war? Or even just like, you can even leave that part out and just say, well, like, you know, murdering innocent people. Like Sharon Tate was like, I don't know, 7 or 8 months pregnant. I think one of the killers said that she said, you can't kill me because I'm already dead. So, and just like, you know, they're butchered with knives and strangled, and just it was a horrible bloody scene, and they splatter all the blood on the wall, and they wrote pigs right on with blood on the wall. If it seems like I couldn't tell you anything at all that would like possibly justify that, right? It's just you can't think that you think about. So that's just one crime. So think about the Manson murders, like that fateful night that is called the Tate La Bianca murders back in the 70s. So that fateful night, God was watching from heaven, watched it all transpired, watched the pregnant woman be, you know, and her unborn child being, you know, eviscerated with a knife, watched people being strangled and killed in horrific ways, and did nothing, right? So it seems like if you could imagine like Manson give you a reason why what he did was justified, it seems like that same no possible reason objection could be applied to God too.
What if any form of death is actually just a good thing, and that's why God doesn't do anything about it, because death is just good? We view it as awful because we don't see it.
Let's just drink some poison and kill ourselves.
I mean, yeah,
Death
that
is
could
good.
be the argument.
So, you know, death is, well, what about like, I mean, pain? You say like pain is good, pain and suffering.
Yeah, but pain doesn't last forever. Death does. So I mean, I guess it's almost as if, I guess that's how you could justify why God wouldn't do anything about any of these awful cases, because pain happens, but death happens last.
Death isn't bad, but like, that doesn't mean life's not bad either.
Yeah.
I mean, I think neither life or death are bad. They're just both like.
They're both states.
Yeah.
But like, isn't like murder seen as like a quintessential
No,
example of a wrong act?
It's awful to us, and it makes sense why it is, because we don't have a perception of what comes after, or even what that would be like. But we don't even know how different it may be when you die. I mean, even if it is just like, what was the philosopher said?
Think about Socrates.
Yeah, where it's either just an infinite sleep or something better. Right. Both are good. It could be that, and maybe that's why God chooses to do nothing, because death is actually a good thing.
Means there's no hell.
And that means no more pain.
But you're depriving a person of like the rest of their life, though. I mean.
Yeah, no, it's still awful to kill someone and take that from them, especially because it's their life and they should just choose how that happens. But
yeah, so it seems like, you know, murder's bad, and
I still think the person that murders is accountable, but the person that was murdered.
why don't we give them a reward if death is so great? Maybe like,
Because we don't have evidence of that. I'm just saying that might be the reason why God chooses not to do anything.
maybe we should take that school shooter and give him a medal and say, you know, we need more school shooters, right?
You're taking that differently. It has to be based on the idea that death is a better part.
It's different.
He's
killed people.
But in reality, those people are still guilty because they're not passing on.
They're doing God's will. It's like Judas.
I wouldn't even say it's God's will either. I'm just saying when it happens.
People die in all kinds of ways, you know, like.
Yeah, that
disease
sucks,
murdered
right?
you,
Well, you know, there are
the
funerals.
hurricane murdered you.
It sucks for us because we have
the
memory of
hurricanes are like. I mean, I guess we are. We're just trying to warm the planet up. No more weather at some point, maybe. Just always super cold. That's bad too, though, because the cold kills people. Everything kills people.
Yep.
Everything is deadly in some form or another. Just like. We just need restraint.
Plus
we just don't kill everybody until we just like thin out our population. So like, we need some kind of restraint, and then like.
I mean, as long as you're not okay with like decriminalizing murder or some shit.
It'd be like the purge or whatever.
I mean, like
right?
murder's a little extreme, but like I feel like you could eventually. Well, I guess you would just leave it criminalized. But like if we decriminalize violent acts against people, in the beginning, people are gonna come out of their shell because they've been so fucking repressed. But after a certain point in time, people are gonna get used to, like, if I say some slick ass shit to this guy, he might beat the shit out of me. So like, I'm not gonna say some slick ass shit and taunt him, because that's what we've gotten to now. We can tease the fuck out of you and instigate and antagonize you, to the second you respond, now you're the one who's the aggressor. So it's like, it's kind of flip-flop, it's kind of bullshit. It's just like a force of continually repressing each other by repressing our natural tendencies to be violent. Everybody had their room to be violent, like, we would eventually thin back out to like a more respectful nature with each other, because we realized, like, maybe I'm not ready to fight today. Or maybe I fought so much I've been breaking my hands I can't fight anymore. Maybe that means I've been too aggressive my whole life and I should rethink myself, versus just like feeling victimized and pushing back because like I can't do anything and I just have to deal with my emotions and feel like I'm wrong for being angry or having violent thoughts. Like, it's
And
not
what's up with all the
insane.
violent thoughts, right? That's like part of human nature too.
Yeah,
Like,
we should restrain it.
particularly like in men, like men are violent. You know, you look at like the people that commit violent crimes are predominantly like young men. It's because you get testosterone coursing through their system, and you add in some like inequality and social problems, and it's sort of, you get people and stress of modern life, and people explode. But even in the ancient world, you had things like that without the institutions to stop them. So
I can't remember the study, but I feel like you know how they used to do a bunch of beheadings and public executions all the time back in the day over like across the pond. They say notably like there was always more females in the audience. Like females tend to like love watching violence, where men love committing acts of violence more.
interesting. This hits to the free will thing, right? So there's like two kinds of evil in the world. There's like natural evil, which is like people dying of old age or getting cancer, or you know, some sort of horrible neurological disease like Stephen Hawking, right?
He died.
Yeah.
It sucks.
Dude. What the fuck?
And he lived a long time. But usually people with Lou Gehrig's disease don't last so long.
Yeah, but he was smart and rich, so they never really keep him alive as long as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, he was smart but also like he was a fighter too.
Yeah.
And his wife kept him from pulling the plug on him when he was in a bad way. But you know, the guy couldn't move on his own, and had a little voice box, and you know, they had to because he couldn't breathe, they had to take out his voice box, and so the guy's basically, you know, like non-mobile, but his brain's still working. And you know, there's all kinds of things that afflict people that aren't famous and don't have amazing intellectual ability or an indomitable will. They end up suffering terribly. So there's those things. There's like the food chain that runs on the fear and pain and death, and then there's the things that human beings do to one another, like robbery. Like there's a bunch of strong arm robberies going on, like in the University District. Some guy got punched. He's like talking to a couple of guys in the subway and just, you know, shooting the breeze, and then he goes out to go home, and they jump him and beat him up and take his stuff. What was that? Every day you read some horrible crime, and somebody's shot or beat up. There's some woman who was an engineer who was beat up. She was a Muslim engineering student in Britain, beat up by some white supremacists, and then like died later from brain hemorrhage, right? People that are plowed into by illegal aliens in the U.S. You know, who like a 4.0 student who's ready to go on to grad school, you know, and their life is over. So you've been
These
something
things are
like that.
awful because memory. Death is awful because we have memory of things, but when you die, you don't attain memory anymore. So that's why I think death may be a good thing, because all memory that you had is now gone. But for us, it's still awful because memory exists.
Yeah, we don't like death because we're greedy and we lost somebody in our lives. We lost a part of our world, is how we feel. Versus like, I mean, we're concerned, like we know this person's never going to move on again, but like at the same time, what we notice is not so much the absence of what that person no longer has because their life is gone. We just notice the absence in our life. So it's really death is the feelings against death is just mostly greedy narcissism, I feel like.
So ignorance.
You think it's
Ignorance is
greedy and
bliss.
narcissistic to fear death?
Why do
But
most
the
people
most
have such a
intense
strong drive
form
for
of
self-preservation?
Death. True bliss. Complete ignorance.
Most living things, actually.
Yeah, it seems like that's part of like the
It's like
being
we're
alive
all
is wanting to
supposed to live.
survive.
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, because we experience pain, I think that's why.
And
We
pain
don't
is
want
like
it.
an
Experience
evolution.
pain to help us
Learn to
if
not-
something's wrong, we need to get out of here, we need to change something. It's part of the whole self-preservation thing.
But we're not immortal, so I mean, like, we
And
want to
that's
last as
mostly
long
for
as we
genetic.
can, but we can't last forever
We
anyway.
can make kids though, and they'll live on and make more kids.
So that's what it's about. It's about reproduction, it's not about living.
And it's basic biological component, yeah, that's what life is about.
But not everything reproduces the way we do. Some people basically still have there's mitosis,
Still
asexual
reproduce.
reproduction, like.
Living,
It's about
living
passing on
isn't-
information. It's about extending the experience versus like living. It's about extending your experience through time.
Sounds like this idea that death isn't really that bad. It seems like kind of like it might be a defense mechanism of not wanting to like fearing death, but not wanting to give it power. So you say, well, death isn't really that bad. It's kind of like if you like, I don't know, like you get like dumped by a romantic interest, and you're like, I didn't like that person anyway. They sucked. I can do better, right? Whereas like when you're worried about the breakup, you're like, please don't leave me. And then after like you're pretty much cut off, you're like, oh, I didn't. That was a terrible relationship anyway, right? So it's like you think, well, I'm gonna die, so, and I really don't like that fact, so maybe I'll try to convince myself death isn't bad. But let's just take like the suffering part, right? So let's assume that death is only bad because it makes other people that are still around unhappy. And what about so God gives, the story is God gives people free will, and the people misuse their free will and cause other people to suffer. Well, why doesn't God intervene? Like why can't God? I mean, why can't you have free will? First of all, like why don't people just freely choose what's good?
It's subjective.
Okay, let's assume that good and evil aren't subjective, and let's assume that
Then we would use
causing
like
a
the
person
Ten
pain
Commandments.
for your own enjoyment is bad, evil, right? So like sadistic pleasure is bad, and also causing someone to suffer, like I don't know, punching someone in the face to take their backpack, to hawk their stuff in the street to buy drugs. Let's assume that's bad, right?
That's definitely bad.
Yeah. So
And if you
so
ask why do we do it, well, because it feels good to get high.
right, but it's,
Emotional effect.
But so why doesn't God prevent stuff like that? Like,
Why
First-
does God make me high all the time?
yeah, well, that's a good question. Like, people do desperate things to feel better because their life sucks, because life sucks, right? So, of course, people are going to do screwed up things because we live in a screwed up world.
Yeah.
It's a six-ad world, right?
But I mean, things are awful, like all those murders and everything are awful because there's an emotional effect to it, especially for the person that it's happening to. I got all my things stolen. There's an emotional effect. You feel like you've lost something, all that work and time you've put into it.
Well, you
But
did.
death, you lose emotion. You don't have emotion anymore. And that may be true bliss because it's complete ignorance. It's,
Well, it's complete annihilation.
I haven't, but that's my best guess. I mean, if there is an
Let's
afterlife,
leave this question about whether death is
depends
bad
on what
or
type
not
of emotions
aside.
pass on through that, whether your memory passes on.
But you don't have any capacity for pleasure anymore either, though. And you'll lose out on all the future
That is fair.
happiness.
That is fair, but
you get.
complete ignorance.
Would it be bad if I murdered Trump because he's a piece of shit? I think a lot of people would have. Is that bad?
Oh,
Is that good? It
oh
feels
now
good.
suddenly you're
50-50.
more. No, now suddenly you're a moral realist. This is what I hear from relatives. I hear morality is relative, but Trump is the bottom of evil.
I'm just trying to pick a figure that some people would like agree on him being dead though.
And maybe half the country.
And then the other
Person
person's
that
like,
half
no.
that says he's
It's
awesome.
like I said, Kim Jong Un, my house might get bombed, but like.
Yeah, people in the middle. I doubt that.
If I kill
Kim
him,
can barely get his missiles,
but I mean, yeah, he really has trouble there. I mean, I heard he's trying to negotiate with.
Let's try to keep things on track.
So
So
if
we're
I
talking about
kill-
the free will defense.
If I kill him, like it feels good to kill somebody who like is a horrible person, and like in the end, like the world might be a better place without Trump. So like murder was bad, but
then
everything
you'd
else
have to deal
around
with
it
it till the
was
future.
good. The feeling to do it, everybody else's feeling of the consequences were good. but like the act that I did to get to the best end scenario was.
I feel like we're going afield and talking about like the relativity of ethics and the arguments for and against that. I'm trying to stick with this free will defense, right? So the idea is, okay, why is there evil in the world? And the answer is God couldn't logically create people who would only do good, and he had to create a world with a possibility to do evil, and that's why there's all this suffering in the
So
world.
then should we talk about the logic of a completely good world? Like, we kind of do, we come to utopias.
Well,
We have all these
so
utopias.
the argument is that it's so the idea is free will is a really good thing, and you can't have free will without the possibility of doing evil. Therefore, a world with free will and evil is better than a world with no free will. So that's the argument.
I mean, I disagree with the argument, though. I feel like it'd
So
be
what do you
better if
think?
we were in utopia.
So you think that free will is not good? Or you think it's consistent with with there not being any evil?
It doesn't sound free either way, so let's might as well just disband with it all together and just stick with the all good.
So you think like the free will is overrated, and that God, if there really was a God, he would create, who was good,
He wouldn't
he would create a world that without free will and without suffering.
I don't know.
Other thoughts on like this free will theodicy?
I mean, what about a world that was only bad? What would that be like?
Yeah.
What if there was no good in the world whatsoever? So like, what's the other side of that?
Good
Sorry?
without bad, bad without good.
There's like a philosopher, I think this is Schopenhauer's argument. He was like I think he was depressive. Not manic depressive, just like suffered from terrible depression. He had this idea that the world was contained the maximum amount of suffering. It was kind of like Leibniz says this is the best of all possible worlds. And Schopenhauer said it was the worst of all possible worlds, and that if there's just one iota more of suffering, the world would sort of collapse in on itself. So he says the worst possible world God could create. His philosophy is called pessimism. So go figure. But but it does seem like that you could argue that it's logically inconsistent, or you can have a world with free will and no suffering, because if free will includes the ability to do evil, then people have the ability to do evil. Some of them will, and then that will cause other people to suffer.
So there are no states of being outside the ones we only have now.
That's an extremely abstract question. I'm not sure it's germane to the question I asked. So the question I asked is, could you have a world where people only freely did good? If that seems inconsistent, then maybe the free will defense would make sense, because you'd say, well, got a world with free will, let's assume free will is like an important thing, that it's good to be free, and but it's logically impossible for God to create a world with free will and without suffering. And so God tolerates suffering because he couldn't have a world without suffering and have free will at the same time.
That's not perfect though.
Yeah, and it sounds like we're still not free to play with these abstract states of being. Like, God selected suffering as one of the ones we could freely choose from, but there are other states he didn't let us freely choose from, so it wasn't completely free. That's kind of where I'm going with
Oh, okay. Well, I guess free will, means being able to choose between alternatives, but doesn't mean being able to, choose anything. It means
So we have all the possibilities are available
Yeah.
to us.
I guess the question is how many choices are enough choices to say you have free will.
Yeah.
But we could just change this and say, like, okay, God wanted to allow a restricted version of free will where people have significant freedom, but not like omnipotence, right?
So death is a good thing because it gives you an overabundance of more possibilities.
Oh,
It's like a
exactly.
trial and error right now. Free will is a trial and error to see how we'll do when we move on to the next level.
Well, yeah, and then the question is, what about when people get to heaven, right? So what's going to keep people from sinning once like all this is like done and people get to heaven, right? You pass the
Maybe
test.
they'll lose the knowledge of good and evil, and they'll only know the knowledge of good.
Well, why not do that now?
Because we know what evil is.
Right, but why not? Why doesn't God do whatever This is the second thing. This idea that, and these are two different ideas, but sometimes they're stuck together. The idea that okay, so we're doing this sort of development over a long period of time where we suffer, we learn, we make choices, and eventually, at the end of our lives, if we pass the test, then we get to heaven. Well, what's going to prevent us from screwing up and ruining heaven? You know what? Won't there be like strong arm robberies in heaven?
I said we
Or
won't have the knowledge of evil.
Somebody get their feelings hurt, or
We won't have the knowledge of evil.
well, why doesn't he get rid of the knowledge of evil right now?
Because free will exists on earth, and that's how he
Or
wanted free will.
does evil become good when you die? To the fact
Okay,
like-
that's
No, because God can commit genocide and all kinds of stuff. For him, that's good. We're not allowed to do that. So when we get to that stage, we come to the point where like the distinction is no longer there. They're all the same thing. Everything becomes good. Well, everything becomes good.
I
Once you
feel like
die.
you're changing the meanings of like basic terms.
I mean, when we look at what we can see of the afterlife from God, like God gave us the Bible and He's doing all this like pretty horrific shit that apparently seems to be like divine. And so like we're just unable to conclude the divine aspect of all the negatives. So we look at this dichotomy where God's not dualistic, like humans are dualistic, at the very least for male and female. So we see this thing in like A or B where God doesn't, everything is just like me. So it's not good or bad for God. For God it just is.
Well, it does
He
seem like
says-
there's a double standard. I mean, so, but the argument is that God like does certain things. So there's one problem is God does things that seem to be evil, like in the Bible. And so if you accept the Bible, the Word of God, then God commits genocide and starts wars and drives out indigenous people and steals their land and gives it to his special chosen people. And so on and so forth, right? So that's one problem. But if we just look at the abstract, maybe apart from the biblical narratives, the idea is that God allows, rapes and robberies and people to be beat up in dark alleys and people to be tortured in third world hellholes and starve to death in North Korea and Venezuela, coincidentally, but both commune nations.
I think
And so let me finish. So God allows all these bad things to happen because if he stepped in and struck the leader of North Korea dead and freed all his people, then we wouldn't have to do it, right? If he got rid of the government of Venezuela and made food magically appear, why would human beings have to solve their own problems? So the idea is that if you make a choice, you have to have consequences for that choice. There have to be real world consequences. If God sort of stepped in every moment, that we would learn anything, and people wouldn't really be free.
Does evil create good?
If you steal from
well,
me-
actually, God, maybe God can bring.
If
good out of
someone
evil.
robs a store, so let's say this is the first robbery ever. Someone robs a store. What's the response? To help. Usually.
Yeah.
The store goes into a financial hole but works their way back and ended up making themselves stronger because they
Or
could come back from
let's
zero.
make a police force. We can have people protecting other people
Yeah.
To employ people.
combat this. So evil was done, but good was made to combat evil. So the real question is would good exist if evil didn't exist? Because if good, do you see where I'm going with that?
Yeah,
Well,
but
but the
Help
police,
me.
you think, well, it's great that we have police, but then why do we need police? Well, because people are out there committing crimes and hurting
Yeah,
other people.
but I'm just saying that the evil does create some good. No matter how evil it is, it still creates
so
good.
evil is a part of spiritual development.
Yeah, I think that this idea that suffering builds character, maybe somebody in here had their parent tell them that. I don't know, parents still say that anymore. Suffering builds character, right? The idea is go out and pull some weeds or whatever,
Suffering
hot
is-
sun,
suffering
'cause it's
is-
good for you.
Suffering is actually good for development of children and falling.
You learn self-discipline. You
It's not
get up early in the
self-discipline, it's
morning.
more of just how to respond to our environment better.
Right, but the idea is why you need to learn self-discipline or why you need to learn to work hard and all that stuff. Well, it's because, again, life sucks, right?
Yeah.
You got to work hard because you got to support yourself because we don't live in paradise. So, but then whose fault is that? It's not my fault that why is my life toil and trouble and worry? Well, it's because of the world that God created.
So that's the toughest part is because someone ate an apple thousands of years ago.
And there,
That's why I suffer.
so you can think about there's sort of the specific Christian narrative of Christian theology, Jewish theology too, and Islamic, right? So there's that, and then there's kind of the more abstract philosophical question, and so you can like talk in general about like the free will theodicy without like relying on that story.
Like this is all just the creation. This is all, like good and evil is just kind of like, the fact that God made, it's a deterministic viewpoint. Like God created good and evil in the beginning, and this is just a blowback from all that. He doesn't allow evil because God made the watch of humanity. Like the gear doesn't have a choice but to push this gear. You know, like it's getting made to push this gear by like just everything being perpetuated forward. And it's like he made good and evil in the beginning, and because he made it, like this is just still.
That's kind of like the deist idea that God set up the world and sort of, you know, lets it run its course and doesn't intervene. And then the question is, could God still be morally good if that's the story? So let me just hit two more things. So I have another analogy. This is my gun club analogy. I think I don't know if was this something I did? I don't remember if this was in the video I showed for when I wasn't here on Tuesday. I'll just pitch it again real quick. So imagine like you're with your friends on the way to the shooting range. You got all your guns, your AR-15s, pistols. You're heavily armed. You're gonna just do some target shooting. And as you're walking to your cars to go drive off to the range, you hear this voice in like a deep dark alley. Help! Help! Somebody help me! Right? And there's some woman being attacked by a guy with a knife, right? And you're heavily armed. You got a bunch of firearms right there. The guy's got a knife. He doesn't look like he has a gun. And there's like a bunch of you, and there's one of him. So you think, well, let's go save this woman. And your friend says, oh, we're late for the range. We gotta go, and there's only a few hours of daylight left. I want to get some shooting done. And we get in trouble, get trouble with the cops. We'll be here all day. We'll never make it to the range. And so, and then you say, okay, let's go. And you just leave. And cries of help if recede in the distance. So what would we think of you and your friends?
In that situation, it's a little bit unfair. Like, what if we rewrote it to that one analogy where, like, you're walking across a bridge and there's a switch, and you look down and like the switch controls the train tracks. And, there's a big fat guy with a broken leg in the track, and then like you want to save him, but then there's like a bunch of kids partying on the other track because they don't think the train's coming. Like, do you throw the switch and save the guy with the broken leg, and like reroute that a bunch of?
That's a different moral dilemma.
It's still an important one.
You still have. You're still responsible. You have the ability to save somebody's life, even if without the other people. Like,
let's stick with my analogy for the moment. Okay, come to yours after.
I'm gonna say no. You don't have any responsibility. You didn't. She should have been in that damn alleyway.
What if you watch her like some guy come up behind her and drag her into the alleyway? She's just walking down the street.
She should have drove, but I'll shoot the guy. I'll shoot the knife out of his hand and like keep going. Like, all right, you got a chance to run. You got that chance.
The point of what should have been an obvious analogy is that if you have the means and opportunity to save a person from suffering, that you have a moral responsibility to do it, and that God is responsible in the same way. Like if God has all power and he could intervene and doesn't, it seems like he's bad. Like he would be evil.
On the free will side,
responsible.
I feel like we shouldn't be responsible to be all of our brother's keepers. Otherwise, all we'll ever do is run around helping each other. Because I'm so busy helping everybody else, everybody has to continuously help me, and then we all just go into this like degrading pit of like.
You make a point that you shouldn't, and people have this idea about like that morality is all about going around finding all the people you can possibly help. But there's a difference between somebody who's like being immediately victimized of a crime, and you can, with little or no cost yourself, intervene.
So if determinism is real and we don't have free will and things are just done, then you could say that all of the good that is done in the world is actually the work of God, and the absence of good people is evil. And so in those instances where people are slaughtered in their homes with no one to save them, it's just the absence of good. Good doesn't exist, and if determinism is true, then it means that God is just working through people to do good deeds rather than doing it himself as like an identity of God. He's doing it through the people that he created.
But sometimes he doesn't, though. That's the whole problem. Is sometimes he doesn't, and it seems that if God really were good and he were all powerful, that these sorts of things wouldn't happen. at least not to the extent that they happen in the world we find. And let's
It'd
take
be
our
interesting to
attempt.
be able to quantify the amount of good and evil in the world.
Well,
You could somehow quantify that
I think
number.
you can do that. I mean, just look at the number of like murders, robberies, rapes, incidences of
Yeah, but we
torture,
can't really quantify the good
people
that
suffering
happens.
in burn wards and cancer.
Charities and sacrificial suicide.
Like there's
Yeah,
a lot of
there's so much.
there's
To,
a
like,
lot
get
of suffering
perfect
in the
number is
world.
what I'm saying.
There's a lot of suffering in the world, and there's enough to make people wonder about why a loving heavenly Father would allow it all.
I think it was a 50-50. That's just yin and yang.
Okay, it's back to Eastern metaphysics, which is different, right? So, I mean, you can do that, right? You can say, well, God's not really good, or you could say evil's not real, right? I mean, those are two ways of trying to get around it. But those aren't like, now you're not in the world of Western theism anymore. You're going to Eastern mysticism, or some other different view of God. All right, let's take our 10-minute break, and we'll come back and talk about the meaning of life.
Ultimately, I believe.
back. All right, so, any last comments on the problem of evil?
Evil.
You should remember that, like the concept of a theodicy. A theodicy is just those are one of those terms that'll be on the exam. It's just an attempt to explain the problem of evil without sacrificing God's omnipotence or his goodness. So you take the problem of evil at face value and then try to solve it. So it's different.
With God.
Yeah, so you're trying to explain how evil is consistent with God,
Gotcha.
given the same definition of God.
You're calling it theodicy.
So, and I think, this spiritual development theodicies, you could say, like, why didn't God create ready-made saints? So there's one, like, answer. You can just say, look, God says, well, he's going to put us through the ringer, so we're, purified by fire, and we learn. If you're not doing that on your phone, please. If there was a God, he'd prevent you from doing that.
Smite me.
So the idea is God causes us to suffer in order to help us learn through suffering and then become like morally better until we're fitted for heaven, right? So we have trials and tribulations, we learn life's lessons, and finally, at the end of our lives, we die, peacefully in our sleep, like my grandfather, not yelling and screaming like his passengers, and finally get to go to heaven, right? So there we are, but then the question is like, well, why did God put us through all the rigmarole? Why not just like make us like that to begin with?
You left out a pretty important story there.
What's that?
He died peacefully with his screaming passengers. What?
Oh yeah, he died peacefully in
driving
his
the
sleep,
car.
not yelling and screaming with like his passengers. Anyway, but
Oh, I get it.
yeah. So but the idea is of why does God put us through this veil of tears, and why does he do things the hard way? Like imagine like okay, like I follow like Sly Stallone on Instagram, right? And that he's still like, and he's like in his 60s, he's in his late 60s I think now too, and he's still doing like these mad exercises and just has like giant meat arms and like works out every day, and he busts his ass like for a couple hours every day doing his workout, and still still looks good. But what if he could just like take a pill to do that?
One day he probably will.
Yeah, well, but it would seem it would be, why go through, would he continue to go through all the blood, sweat, and tears to have like a totally ripped and toned body if you
Some
could
people
just take
do
a
it
pill?
for like the endorphins as well.
I suppose some people enjoy it.
But I mean, you do drugs for that
Right,
too.
yeah. Just imagine like, it seems like, so certain things are a means to an end. So you think about like, what would be some other goal? Like suppose you want like, I don't know, you want to make $1 million, and someone says, okay, well there's I got my surefire plans to make $1 million. So this first plan is I just give you $1 million. The second plan is I teach you how to start a business, and in like 20 years you'll have $1 million. You think, who wouldn't take the $1 million? It seems like it would be irrational not just to take the money, right? And I suppose people have this idea, well, I want to earn it and yada yada because I want this feeling of pride, or what have you, right? But why do you want, like, you're like, well, I want to learn how to do it, right? Why? Well, what if I lose the $1 million you gave me, right? So it's all based on like problems in this world, which involves like where there are thieves and where loss is possible and where bad things happen, right? So it's just kind of like Hume says, for example, like he talks about this drafty house and says like, what if someone says, well, if the window's shut right, then there wouldn't be any airflow because of the way the crappy design that the house has, and it would the air would get really stale inside. So you need the windows to be drafty to let in the cold air, so the place doesn't stink because of the mold coming up from the basement, because of the leaky basement. And Hume says, you would rightly say that, well, why is there a leaky basement, right? So people will say things like, well, if there was no death, then there'd be overpopulation. But that's part of the system, this crappy system that God made in the first place, right? Where there's like limited space, right? So these are all sort of interrelated problems, and they're based on God's design. But God's an omnipotent being, right? He can create any world he wants, but he created this world with all its defects and limitations. So the same thing with the spiritual development idea. Well, you think, well, we need to develop like discipline and courage and heroism and whatever other like moral qualities we have to develop it through suffering. Well, why doesn't God just sort of create those in us to begin with? Why put us through suffering and go through this long, drawn-out, horrific process to have some end result when God could just snap his finger and make us that way? And then usually people fall back on the free will defense, and then is a question about like whether it's really, if it's unnecessary, whether it's actually God's morally good in allowing it. And why couldn't, it seems like another thing with the free will defense, God could kind of be really sneaky about things. Like you can imagine a world where there's almost no suffering, where like the police always get their man, where nobody ever really gets hurt, where people are saved in the nick of time. Kind of like, I don't know, like a movie from the Hallmark Channel or something, right? Where, there's nothing, or like, an episode of Leave It to Beaver, right? So the beef still has to do his homework, and it's boring, and sometimes he gets into hijinks and problems, right? But nothing really bad happens. Like he doesn't get like molested by some creepy neighbor down the street. I can't think of the worst thing that happened to him. I don't think like a pet has even died in that show. Like it's all, suburbia at its best, right? So you imagine God could create a world like that, and it would just be, nobody would notice that God was kind of behind the scenes making sure that nothing too bad happened, and he's smart enough to do it. So then the question is, why didn't he do it? And then the free will thing, like my gun club analogy, what if, think about the police, right? So do the police violate free will? And is that a reason to get rid of the police? Imagine there's some guy who's like, he shows up in a bank and he pulls out a gun and points at the clerk and says, hand over the dough. And there's an off-duty police officer in the bank, and he pulls out a gun and shoots the guy, right? Would you say, oh, you violated that guy's free will? Or what if I hear my neighbor beating his wife and threatening to kill her, and I call the police? Do I violate his free will? Or there's some kid shows up. Suppose I'm like an elementary school teacher, and some kid shows up with like bruises, says, "Mommy told me to tell you I fell down the stairs." Right? So like if I call Child Protective Services, is that, if I violated mom's free will to beat her kid? It seems like we have like protective institutions to protect people, and then we don't think about those as being violations of free will. So
in some sense, we have to commit an evil to commit a good. Because technically, yes, you are depriving them of their free will, which you could say is evil, but in the long run, it is good because you're also saving others.
Yeah, so it's the idea that free will doesn't have to be an absolute. You can still like punish criminals, and we try to do that with our police force. Well, why can't God act as a cosmic policeman? What would that violate people's free will? You could still commit evil, and God would punish it. And every time you did something wrong, you get punished. People still might not be able to resist temptation, but there'd be a lot less people doing bad things, because they would know that punishment would be swift, severe, and certain. Mm-hmm. In the real world, where we have imperfect police forces and people that sit outside and don't listen to the gunfire and crouch behind a concrete wall while people are being massacred, even though they're sheriff's deputy in Broward County, right? It's like, or you have like people ignore warnings, like this guy's crazy, he's gonna shoot up the school, and he posts on YouTube, I'm going to be a professional school shooter, and the FBI can't figure out who he is, even though he posts under his real name. And so, like, so we have, like, incompetent, often incompetent police that don't do a good job of protecting people. But God could be like the super duper policeman and make sure that criminals didn't brutalize people and kill people and make people suffer, but he doesn't.
What if it's evil to have praise?
Is he able to do what?
It's evil to. Here's how I'm thinking about it.
Like some people do good things so that they can be praised by people or have like recognition from people. What if that's actually a part of sin? And so God can't sin, and so by him coming down and doing all these heroic things, almost as if he was a superhero, he would technically be sinning because he would be, having the glory of
God
all
might get
people.
too prideful or something.
Yeah.
God can be sinful against himself?
Yeah, it depends if that's a sin or not. And then making the argument whether it is a sin or not, that's what it comes down to.
But and God could be super sneaky about, imagine a world with no school shootings. And like the concept of school shooting wasn't even really a thing until you get all these kids raised by single moms, hopped up on antidepressants, and bullied in school, and and then some of them go off. It's like the school shooting things of students is a fairly new thing, despite and it has nothing to do with like
I think it has a lot to do with social
guns.
media.
And so maybe the social media stuff too, right? But there's and maybe a rise in mental illness is part of modern society. But you can imagine, before there were school shootings, people didn't say, I wonder why there aren't any school shootings, right? Well, imagine, there were no school shootings ever emerged. Nobody would be the wiser if God just sort of, made a policeman, a little less incompetent, for example. They had an open house for public safety here on campus. I must say, I appreciate our public safety officers here, and they seem to do a good job. They've always been completely professional.
That's good.
So, but police are human beings. They're imperfect. They make mistakes. But God could just sort of God could call the tip line and make sure he gets someone who's going to do something. Right? He gets make anonymous phone calls. He wouldn't even have to do anything especially miraculous or mess with anybody's mind or anything. He'd just tip off the right people or just arrange circumstances just so in a way that would be minimally invasive. Anyway,
Maybe
just
he
a
is.
but then because things would be a lot worse than if he didn't. I don't know. But then why doesn't he do it more? I suppose would be the question.
It could be worse.
Meaning of life. So here's the speech from Macbeth. So this is the Macbeth, through various Machiavellian techniques, has made himself king. He's assassinated. He's in cahoots with his wife, who assassinated the good King Duncan. He's made himself king, but his grasp on power is faltering, and he's about to be deposed himself. And here comes his speech as he's about to lose everything. In Act 5, at the end of Act 5, right? So, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, brief candle, life is but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So here's his characterization of life. Talking about the inevitability of death, its briefness, and he's a couple of analogies here. It's a brief candle that goes out eventually. A poor player that struts and frets his hour up on the stage and then is heard no more, right? So you come in, you think about this as being you want to push up amp up the metaphor a little bit, right? Think about a bit player. You're bit player, you're like guard number 2, right? And you're there for the whole play and you're waiting for your 15 minutes of fame. In this case, maybe 2 seconds, and you say, "Sir, the prisoner has escaped," right? That's your one line, right? So, and that's pretty much life. Like, you have your little bit, you have your time on the stage, and and then you start slowing down, hair starts falling out, body starts falling apart. Pretty soon you're in a rest home, and then you're dead, right? And then this other part, it's about its significance. A tale told by an idiot. So idiot is kind of an old-timey word for like a, what we might call a developmentally disabled adult. So, and now it just becomes a pejorative for like a foolish person. But, so idiot, he's talking about, and if you've run into like, maybe a person that's got like a mental impairment, like maybe living on the streets, maybe somebody personally, probably under like assisted living in some way, and they just tell you these crazy, incomprehensible stories, and you have no idea what any of it means. We have a guy that like wanders the streets in Cottage Grove talking to himself, and he has occasional moments of lucidity, but mostly he's just talking to himself, and you have no idea like what he's going on about. All these stories that he's telling himself.
Those people can be really interesting to
talk
to though, sometimes.
He might be schizophrenic. Anyway, so he, one time he's walking by my house, and I have this really fat cat named Millie, and he's like walking by and looked over, and I looked at the window and said, "Look at the size of that cat." And then he just kept on walking and talking to himself, right? But like I listen to these crazy things he says, and like, and it's like some incomprehensible story. Right? So the idea is like, imagine some crazy homeless person comes up to you and just tells you this like gibberish story that like makes no sense to you. And that's sort of a metaphor for life. Right? It doesn't make any sense. No rhyme or reason to it. And this is sort of the expression, the existentialists call this the absurdity of life. Understanding the absurd. The idea that life doesn't make any sense. Good is not rewarded and evil is not punished. Misfortune can happen at any time, regardless of how much you try to guard yourself against it. Your best laid plans could come to nothing, and suffering and death are inevitable. And those are the big things. This is what Russell talks about in A Free Man's Worship. And his idea is that if you look at the world objectively through the lens of science, it presents to you a pitiless universe that doesn't give a damn about you, is completely blind to human suffering, and also with the inevitability of death. Right? So, a kind of a bleak picture. And so Russell in A Free Man's Worship says, well, what's the implication of this? Like, what if we want to be rational about this? What's your response to this idea that life apparently doesn't have a meaning? And Russell's an atheist, or he would say an agnostic, but more like the atheist side of agnosticism. At one point he said he's an agnostic, and while it's possible there's a God, it's also possible there's a teapot like orbiting, I think, of the planet Jupiter or something like that, or the moon. I can't remember what the analogy was exactly, but this idea like there's a teapot orbiting the planet Jupiter. Well, it's possible, but it's highly unlikely, and was his pitch for the existence of God. And so he talks about too this idea of the afterlife that most people have, and says that you think about, when I go to heaven, my life will be great. Like, I will wipe away all my tears. I won't suffer anymore. I won't have all the limitations and problems I have in this life. Won't it be great? And then you look at your life and compare it with this sort of idealized heavenly version, and you're like, my life sucks. And so it's kind of like if you, I don't know, suppose you like scrounge up money and save and toil, working some crap job, and you end up buying a car, and you're like, this is awesome. You pay like $500 for it, and it's some like beat up car from it's like a 1994 Toyota Corolla that's leaking oil, but it runs, and it's in pretty good shape, and it'll get you from point A to point B, and you're like, I finally have a car. I'm not going to be on the loser cruiser every day. I'll be able to drive to school. This will be awesome, right? And then like your best friend comes up and he like pulls up in like a Camaro. And it's like totally cherry, totally restored. And he pulls up there and revs the engine and says, "Hey, my dad just bought me a new car. Check it out." And you look at your Toyota and you're like, "That car sucks," right? Whereas before you're on top of the world because you think, "Hey, I got a car. It runs. It's awesome. Life is great." But then somebody comes with something that's like a million times better, and you're like, "Oh, what I have sucks." And Russell says that's pretty much how life is. If you think about how great heaven's going to be, that causes you to hate your life right now, whereas you might otherwise be able to endure it. But you think about how much worse it is compared with heaven, that makes you hate your life all the more. Also, he says this whole like Christian message of sin and salvation robs you of any enjoyment you might have. And, Mr. Russell is quite a player, like seducing the daughters of his friends and romping around, and wrote a book about open marriage. And so, but he might have a point here that if you're always worried about, whether every time you turn around you feel guilty for something, and you always have to ask God's forgiveness for all the bad things you do all the time, every day. You can see how that if there is no God, it's kind of a cruel joke, right? That you're down on your knees pleading for forgiveness for all the sins you committed against a being that doesn't even exist. And so this kind of adds insult to injury. On top of all the suffering in this world, you feel guilty for no reason for things that are perfectly natural and normal, but traditional Christianity tells you should feel bad about them. And then Russell isn't all totally down on religion. He says you look at like the good parts of religion, the best in religion, and this idea of a God of love and justice. He says that's not something that actually exists, and this is something that's kind of bubbling up from like man's conscience, right? It's kind of a projection of our highest aspirations and ideals. And so that's good, and that's like the best part of religion. We should junk this sort of sin and salvation and feeling guilty all the time, and also this idea of this mythical afterlife by comparison to which our life sucks. And we should have these sort of high and lofty ideals that are presented in religion. So his solution, he says, the one thing you gotta watch out for is the religion of Molech. Sometimes it's spelled Moloch. And so the religion of Moloch is this Canaanite deity who required child sacrifice. And so the idol was built as kind of like a giant frying pan or an oven. And so you'd have coals underneath the pan, and you stoke the fires, and you take your firstborn baby and throw it on the frying pan or stick it inside the oven. And Russell says, well, people did that not because they loved or respect Moloch, it's because they feared Moloch. They feared that if they didn't give Moloch their firstborn child, he would get revenge on them. So he says, you can't be constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop and paranoid that something bad's going to happen to you, and kind of walk around with hunched shoulders worrying about, getting cancer or getting beaten and robbed or your mom dying or whatever it is that you're afraid of. So he says you need to face, to have a good life, you should face it with a certain amount of idealism. So have some principles, have some courage. Don't let life beat you down. And also, he says you should have sympathy for your fellow human beings who are in the same boat you are. Right? So we all suffer from the same problems, and so we should kind of hang together and support one another. And so he says, you look at suffering and death, you recognize those things as inevitable. They are what they are. You can't defeat them. That doesn't mean that you should, you recognize them, but you should be, he says, you should be defiant. So he says you should, again, don't give in to nihilism and despair, but live with principles and with compassion and humanity for your fellow suffering human beings, and shake your shake your fist at the universe, say, you're not going to defeat me. You think about this is kind of like that poem Invictus. Let me just some more literature. Let me I called that for a second. I should post this to the class. It's a great poem if you're not familiar with it. Invictus. I used to know it by heart. I have to cheat. It's pretty short. Out of the night that covers me, black as a pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutches of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but embowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade. And yet the menace of the years finds me and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. I think Russell really appreciated this. I think Russell was around when this was written. And this is sort of this idea that even though life beats you down, you have to get back up and shake your fist and say no, you're not going to defeat me. And so that's Russell's sort of idea for a meaningful life. Without God, without a cosmic plan, and without any sort of transcendent meaning, he thinks that this is sort of a way to have a meaningful life in the face of suffering. So what do you think? Inspiring, attractive?
I like it.
Kind of fits in with the stoical view. It's kind of a romantic view, I guess, too. Like romantic in like the literary sense of being kind of full of passion, and it's sort of the idea of being a hero in your own life, overcoming. As kind of a practical strategy, this seems to make sense. Like if you think about yourself as a hero in your own life, of overcoming obstacles, of helping out people along the same journey, it seems like it makes your suffering a little less unbearable or more bearable. And people that end up giving into despair and nihilism seem to end up like really bad off. Bad off. They end up becoming school shooters. To go back to that, right? So this is at least one way. This is a pretty famous humanist essay of ways of dealing with the meaning of life and suffering and death. And the idea is there's this internal attitude of facing life with boldness and with courage, and not letting the facts that suffering and death are inevitable ruin your life, but have the best life you can. I suppose the gloomy existentialists would say life is absurd. That this is kind of a I'm not sure what they would say. There are some existentials are kind of optimistic, but you get these gloomy existentialists like I'm trying to think. Like Schopenhauer's sort of an early existentialist. I don't know what Sartre or some of these other people would say about this. Camus has this book. It's a little essay actually, The Myth of Sisyphus. And Sisyphus is this guy in Greek mythology who's punished by the gods and has to roll a boulder uphill for eternity. And as soon as he gets like up to the top of the hill, just before he reaches the top, it rolls back down, and he has to push it up again. And what Camus says is that we should count Sisyphus happy. Why Sisyphus should be happy doing this futile task is a good question. I think
Good workout.
I think Russell says you do what you can do, and you find meaning in what your hand finds to do, to quote Ecclesiastes.
Infinite endorphins.
Yeah. So a different meaning, and by the way, next term, the spring term, there's going to be a documentary on Tolstoy and Gandhi. Tolstoy actually had a huge influence on Gandhi, and particularly this idea of nonviolent protest. Late in life, he became an anarchist and a pacifist, and wrote a lot about this sort of concept of nonviolent protest.
Tolstoy?
Uh-huh. And he actually wrote, so he wrote a letter to another Indian, and Gandhi saw it when he was a young man, and met with him, and they corresponded back and forth, and Gandhi got a lot of his ideas about nonviolent protest from Tolstoy. So he and Russell basically agreed on like the facts of the universe as science presents them. So he says, Russell's right that we live in this universe that seems to be purposeless in itself. This is early in his life, and so he also had this idea that people like at the time were talking about progress, or in the height of the Industrial Revolution. You're getting like manufactured goods, moving from an agrarian to an industrial society, and the science is progressing, and you've got the steam engine, and you're getting starting of mass communications, and all this stuff's happening, and so and people are talking about, well, this is progress, and then Tolstoy starts thinking about this concept of progress and says, well, progress towards what? Like, are things actually getting better? And what's the end result going to be? And he came to conclude that all this talk about progress is just sort of like a lie people told themselves to make themselves feel better about their empty lives. So he has this thing where he says, well, look, what are you? You're like this, let's just say causal, not casual. You're a transitory causal cohesion of particles. So you're just basically a cohesion of particles, and someday you'll break apart. He has this other thing where he says that he compares you to like a lump of dough. He says, you're this little lump of dough, and this lump of dough ferments, and it calls it fermenting life. But eventually it'll stop fermenting, and all its questions will go away along with its fermenting. So this sort of idea that we're born, our minds develop, and we wonder why, and then we die and we never have our questions answered. He's also got this example of this fable from Asian mythology. There's a story about a man, he's chased into a pit by a wild beast, and then he's clinging to a branch over a giant chasm. At the bottom of the chasm there is a dragon with its mouth open, waiting to eat him, and on the surface outside the pit, the wild beast is waiting to devour him also, and meanwhile there are mice eating away at the branch. So like he can't stay holding onto the branch, or the mice will eat through it and he'll go into the dragon's jaws. He can't crawl out of the pit, because if he does that, he'll be eaten by the wild beast. And essentially this is meant as a metaphor for life. No matter what you do, suffering and death are inevitable. So basically the same point as Russell. And Tolstoy, throughout his life, tries to find meaning in a bunch of different ways, and he goes through in his book, I gave you an excerpt of all the different ways where he tries to find meaning in life. So the life of pleasure. So he basically becomes like what they call like a wastrel. So he's born into nobility, and he goes off to St. Petersburg. He drops out of school, and he goes out and becomes like a gambler, and and runs up all these gambling debts and has to get out of town. Finally, he joins the army and fights in the Crimean War, which was especially brutal, and mass slaughter for stupid reasons, stupid political reasons. But then finally, when he's in the war, he starts writing, and eventually he becomes a literary success and starts making a lot of money. So he starts a family and gets some literary fame, and then he gets a lot of money, and then he has these great literary achievements, War and Peace, Anna Karenina. So these great Russian novels. So he's like the most famous guy in Russia. Like as far as like, he's the most famous writer in Russia, and one of the most famous writers in Europe at the time. And he's a great artist, right? He's got everything. And so he, later in life, he's got his midlife crisis, and he's done everything. He's like lived a life of pleasure, finally settled down, had a family, has a career, made a lot of money, accomplished more than most people would ever dream of accomplishing. And yet his life feels empty, and he feels like killing himself. And he wonders, like, he wakes up in the morning wondering, like, what's the point of my life? And he's actually contemplating suicide, even though he's got everything. So then he has this existential crisis. He can't sleep, he can't eat, doesn't know what to do, and he's thinking about killing himself. And then he embarks in this sort of philosophical quest to try to find the meaning of life. I'd like to try this experiment. I'd like to be in Tolstoy's shoes and see if I was suicidal. Like if I had like all the money I could ever want, had a wonderful family. Later in life, he got in some fights with his wife, but I think at this time he had this crisis. And things were going pretty well. Be like famous.
Because when everything
have great
is going
artistic
well,
achievements.
then you're just waiting for something to go bad.
It seems bizarre to me. I'll go on with the story. I'll see. So Tolstoy, first he delves into science, and that seems like a dead end. It just shows you, basically the meaningless, pitiless universe that Russell imagined. This whole idea of scientific progress, he thinks, is kind of a dead end too, because it doesn't really answer the existential questions about meaning. And so then he reads the writing of sages and philosophers, and he studies Buddhism and Islam, Christianity, and he goes and finds like clerics and like grills them about their religion. And then finally, he notes that, well, who are the people that are happy? The people that are the most happy are the peasants, people that work the land, do an honest day's work, and actually do something productive, and have like a simple faith in God. And he says, like, who are like the depressives? Who are the people that are all screwed up? And basically like the intellectuals. So his rich intellectual friends who are spoiled and coddled, born into money, that's the problem. So he thinks the problem really it's intellectual elitism and wealth, and also cynicism and skepticism about matters of faith. And so he concludes that the meaning of life is to be found in the childhood faith that he had, that he abandoned when he was a young man, when he went out and became like a gambler, and then finally went to like career and sought validation in his career and his artistic achievements and fame and all that stuff he thought was empty. And really a meaningful life is to be found in the life of faith. And he has this analogy of the handle. So he says, imagine you go into an eat establishment, you're hungry, you're thirsty, and the owner says, well, you can have anything you want, you just got to go pull the handle for 5 minutes. So, and he said most of his friend would say, why should I have to pull the handle? What's the handle for? And the guy says, well, it doesn't matter what it's for. If you pull on the handle for 5 minutes, just crank it up and down, you can have whatever you like. And Tolstoy says, like, his rich intellectual friends would refuse. They would rather go hungry and thirsty than pull on the handle until someone told them what it was for. And he said this handle is sort of a metaphor for faith. And the idea is you do certain things. You work hard, you have a simple faith in God, and you'll be happy. And you shouldn't wonder why and spend all your time and energy trying to figure things out. You should just do what works. So what do you think about Tolstoy versus Russell?
I think Tolstoy is more interested in Theodicy.
Well, I mean, he does think that, I mean, Tolstoy basically led like a very secular life, and then later in life comes back to the faith of his childhood.
I wonder what made him decide, once again, to come back, that maybe that was a way to have at least an illusion of happiness.
I think
all life is
yeah.
just trying to find illusions that you can produce that cause you happiness. Doing actions that create a sense of happiness for however long.
I think about all these like these Hollywood movie stars who are like, you know, that they're like got money, you know, more money than God. Well, they're all screwed up. They got psychological problems, they're on drugs. And you look at people, you know, like from, I don't know, Marilyn Monroe, most beautiful, desired woman, most famous woman in the United States, but she couldn't sleep because she was depressed, she was hooked on pills, she had all these inner conflicts.
Yeah, again though, I think that's just more unable to keep the brain healthy.
Just like people that constantly eat at McDonald's and don't exercise, their body decays. So what happens when you fail to exercise the mind? Like a lot of people in America, it starts to decay quickly, and you start to end up with these problems of drug addiction and depression, because nobody can understand why their brain makes them feel that way, even though it is them.
Yeah.
But I mean, again, that's why I'm such an advocate for meditation, because I think it is the exercise that is needed for you to keep your mind healthy, to keep your mind thriving, to keep your mind satisfied with the reality that you live in.
Some people would say that these things that Tolstoy is worrying about are sort of this is the way like a sensitive artist thinks about things, or maybe a person with like some sort of a mood disorder, and that really like if you take like a normal, well-adjusted person and you give them like fame and money and a nice family and an occupation they like, they're going to have a happy life. Maybe there's a few bumps in the road, but that overall they're going to be happy and they're not going to feel like killing themselves. And maybe Tolstoy had some special problems related to, I don't know, that he might be right that it's the sort of the rich intellectual class that has these sort of problems. Maybe they generate problems because
They run out of things to want. Instead, they find things to analyze, and then when you start to analyze things, that can go down a lot of different roads.
But maybe like the life of faith was something that worked for him, but maybe there'd be some other things he could do while he held on to his copyrights for his books, which he relinquished later in life. All right, that's all we have time for. Don't forget to take the final down by Thursday, the final